We are ready. Does everyone know who this is?
I'll tell them what
Absolutely.
I think. I'm the great grandson of William Reed, who came here in 1856. Does that explain it? My name's Earl Underwood. My father was born in Blue Rapids in 1921, and all my ancestors lived here in this area, including Washington County as well as Marshall County. And it happened that in 1979 I came to be the pastor at Memorial Presbyterian Church in Marysville, and spent 10 years of my life in the county. And luckily we have a courthouse in Marshall County, and so when I wasn't working, that was part of my life. So my wife says it wouldn't be good for you to live at Beatrice.
I disagree.
If I lived at Beatrice, I'd be here most of the time. Now, anyway, good afternoon. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming. You don't know how much it means to me for you having me here today. About 3 months ago, I decided I wanted to do some work on some of my relatives, and I had heard that some of them were involved in the Underground Railroad, and I thought, I'm going to work on that. And then I talked to Lori, and she says, why don't you come down and do a program? And I said I would. And the reason I'm thankful for you is that when I start working on something, I learn way more than what I'm going to give you today. It's like a teacher. You learn a lot of stuff and you give a little bit out, but you learn more than the kids do. And so I'm glad to be here this afternoon. We're going to talk about the Underground Railroad and how it relates to some of the people who lived in this county. I figure about half the people in Blue Rapids are related to the people I'm going to talk about this afternoon. When someone wrote a county history, they wrote it sometimes 50 years after the events. So when in the writing, when they write about it, they don't get all the data. They just give a little tidbit. And such is the fact of Washington County, Iowa. Washington County, Iowa is way over on the east edge of Iowa. And in that county history, I got in your way, I'm sorry. Way over here in Iowa. And I was reading the county history, and it said these 6 guys went out hunting. Sounds like, hey darling, I'll be home at 5, I'm going to go hunting, right? Well, these guys actually lived in Illinois. And they lived over in Fulton County, Illinois. And there were 3 brothers whose last name was Wasson, and 3 brothers whose last name was Waters. And they didn't just go out hunting for the day, because where they went was Washington County, Iowa, or that direction. And when they got to Washington County, Iowa, something unique happened. That would be like 100 miles, and they were walking. And I don't know, if you go hunting and what if you kill something in 100 miles from home? I don't understand that part, but I do understand what happened to these 6 guys. They were out hunting, and they came to Lime Creek, which is a little river in eastern Iowa. And when they got there, Josiah Wasson says, it'd be a good idea to build a mill here, because this water's moving really good. And we could build a mill here, and a lot of people would come, and we could make money, and it'd be great. And so we find him and the others on the 1836 census of Iowa. That's the first census ever taken in that state. And in 1840, they applied with the territory to put up this mill on the river. And they built it. And Joseph Watson was in charge. And the mill lasted for 8 years when it burned down in 1848. But in 1849, they rebuilt it. And if you go to any of the old histories of Iowa, you'll find that that mill there's a picture of it in 1890, so it still existed for some 50 years later. Now, I've got a question for you. What do you think the name of the place after they lived there was? Come on, all you smart. Watsonville. Watsonville, Iowa. Well, you know, that's named after Josiah and his brothers. That's their name. That's their last name, so they called it Watsonville. Today, the Watsonville does not exist. It's Daytonville, or there's another part of it known as North English. And so the Watsons were there. Now, when people live in an area, their main reason for existence is to make money, to raise a family, and to have something to eat, and then to go from there in the rest of their life feeling satisfied. But there were other things going on at the same time that became really important to this family. In 1820, 16 years earlier, there was a thing called the Missouri Compromise. You may have heard about it. Missouri Compromise was a thing done in the Washington, D.C. Congress that said if a state applies to come in the Union and it wants to be a free state, there's got to be another state that's a slave state. And so when Missouri wanted to be a state, they wanted to be a slave state. And so then Florida would be a free state. That's the way it worked. Actually, what happened was Maine became the free state and Missouri was a slave state. But when Iowa became a free state in 1845, Florida became a slave state at the same time. So that was in 1820 when that was adopted, and Iowa became a state in 1845. In 1850, they took the law and they said, we got to revise this law because the Gadsden Purchase came in. That's a piece of property that was in the southwest in New Mexico, Arizona, in the southern part, bought from Mexico. And so they changed the law a little bit, not too much. They still had the idea that if one state came in as a slave state, the other one had to come in as a free state. In 1854, Congress in Washington, D.C. was more free people than slave-endorsing people. So they changed the law. It was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And the idea at that point was, if a state wants to become free or slave, they have to vote for it. So in other words, if Kansas wanted to become a state, the majority of the people in the state would vote and they would decide, do we want to make this a free state or do we want to make it a slave state? So what happens? Well, what happens is all the people who want it to be a free state try to get people to go there, and all the people who want it to be a slave state want all their people to go there. So all of a sudden the Watsons and the Waters families start to hear all about this. And in Watsonville, the Massachusetts Immigrant Aid Society sends people to Watsonville, Iowa, and their agents there try to encourage people to go to Kansas. They got enough people to go to a place called Lawrence, Kansas in 1856. You may have heard of that. But the people in Missouri didn't like that very much, so they sent, today they're called ruffians. They traveled over to Lawrence, Kansas, and they tried to burn down the town, and they tried to shoot people, and they took all of there were 2 newspapers, and they threw all the newspaper materials into the water, and I mean, they just tried to get these people to leave Kansas and go away. That was in 1856. Now, there's two little towns called Bethany and Eagleville in Harrison County, Missouri. And they play a role in this act because what happens is the people in Washington County, Iowa, the Watsons and the Waters and all of their families and extended families are encouraged to go to Kansas. Some of them begin and they go down here to Harrison County. Anybody ever hear of Rufus Kraft? Sure you have. I mean, he was pretty important here in the Rufus. Anyway, he was a doctor here in town. But before he was here, he was in Harrison County, Missouri. He was there with his uncle, and they were doctors. And the Crafts and the Waters and the Reedies all got together in Harrison County, and they talked about going west, because they kept hearing about all of this that happened. Now, they really didn't move very well. They were a little anxious about going there where they might get killed. You know, I don't think we realize that our ancestors put themselves in major jeopardy in coming to Kansas. It was not an easy trip. And a man, a guy who was really interested, came from New York State, and he came to Iowa, and he says, I want to raise an army, and we will do away with all these people who want slavery. His name was John Brown. John Brown, he worked a trek across Iowa several times, trying to get people to go to Kansas. And at the same time, he would go into Missouri, and he'd take a whole bunch of people with him, and they would steal slaves, take them up to Iowa, and take them across Iowa, and then take them to Canada. So it happened that in July, the middle of July, 1857, he went to Watsonville. Watsonville, Iowa. Now, they already had the Immigrant Society there from Massachusetts. And now there's an Immigrant Society from Wisconsin. And they're there trying to promote Kansas. And John Brown is there with our relatives for 3 weeks. He had in some places it said he had a mule who had a leg that was damaged some way, and he was waiting till that mule got better. The reality is it was a horse. The horse was lame, and he had to wait 3 weeks in order for his horse to get better. His son Orrin Brown was already there. He'd come there earlier trying to get people and foster them to go over to Kansas. And so John Brown met the Watsons and the Waters, and he tried to convince them to go. At the same time, John Brown needed places for people to stop along the way. And so that mill, the Watson Mill, became part of the Underground Railroad. And your relatives, some of you here, and I would guess at least half of you, are descended from the Waters, the Jewels, the Crafts. He had people that stayed in that mill as they went up to Canada. They traveled from Kansas up to Nebraska City, came across Watsonville, and all the way along the way were small places for these people to stay. Now, you may have been to Nebraska City, or at least know about it. There's a Mayhew cabin there, and the Mayhew cabin was a cabin that the family took blacks and they took them underground into a tunnel, and they kept them there for a little while until they went on to the next place. It was John Brown's idea that when people stayed at a safe house, you might call it, that they would know where the next place was for people to go. But they did not know 2 places down the road, because otherwise, if they were arrested, they might give up the information. And so they tried to make sure that no one would be informed. You will not find in any history books who the people in Watsonville were who were part of the slave transition for this people. We know that the family was there, we know the mill was there, and that was the only place that they could stay, so we're sure that the Watsons were involved. By the way, Josiah Watson, his wife was a Waters, so that's the combination situation that we have. In 1857, after John Brown was in Watsonville, our family started to move. And there was a group out of Wisconsin who were in Watsonville, and they said, well, come with us, we'll go across. So they went across Iowa to Nebraska City, and then they went south. And finally they came to a river, and they made a camp, and they said it's a pretty good place to live, and they called the town Holton, Kansas. Now, in my mind, you know, I have all these towns in my mind, and I constantly think that Holton must be between Kansas City and Lawrence. But it's not. Holton's much further north. And so when the people came out of Watsonville in Washington County, they went across and they came down what today is Highway 75, straight south. There wasn't a highway there, but there was a trail, and they came down into Kansas and they started the town of Holton in 1857. The first mayor was, if I can find, I know his last name, but I gotta find him because there's two things involved here. Dr. James Waters. He was the first mayor in 1857 of the town of Holton. It wasn't incorporated yet, so they don't call him the first mayor of the incorporated city, but he was the first mayor of Holton. Then there was Thomas Garvin Waters. Thomas Waters was a silversmith, and he came to Holton, and he opened the first hotel in Holton on the square. It was called, not the Hilton Hotel, but the Holton Hotel, or the Hotel of Hilton. Holton. It's, you know, it's an interesting play on words at that point, but that was in 1857, a long time ago. And that's when a number of the other family members started coming. In 1860, there's a census taken in 1860, and all of our family are there. I mean, all the Waters and all the Watsons are there, including Charles Jewell, who Charles Jewell is very famous for us because he married a Waters. He married Sarah Catherine Waters in 1851 in Watsonville. So he came over too, but he came down through Harrison County, and Rufus Kraft joined him, and they came across to Holton. And so all those people are in Holton. There's only, in 1860, there's only 7 buildings in the town of Holton. 7. There are hundreds of people, but Holton only had 7 buildings in the town. Now, a lot of these people lived in the rural areas, and but close to the town. And so they said they were from Holton, Kansas. There were 1,700 people in 1860 in the area, and a lot of them were relatives of ours. Holton, in Jackson County, a lot of the people who came there, they helped set up these different places for people to go along the trail. Did you know the name of the trail? It was the Jim Lane Trail. Now, I haven't figured out whether General Jim Lane was the same Jim Lane that had the Jim Lane crossing here in Marshall County. It is curious. I've not been able to prove or find it out because he's buried in this county. But this guy was called General Jim Lane. And General Jim Lane set up this trail called the Jim Lane Trail. Went up from Holton, Kansas, up to Nebraska City, and then across Iowa all over to the eastern part. Now there's more than one town in eastern Iowa that had safe houses for blacks. But he did go into Watsonville as well. So look at the connections between the families. Well, that's the major piece of what we're about. But then the question is, well, okay, those people who were in Holton, why did they come to Marshall County? Why did they come and become an area of Blue Rapids? Well, almost all the men who were in Holton in 1860 to 1865 became soldiers in the Civil War. There were 2 units. One was the Kansas 5th Cavalry, 5th Regiment Cavalry, and the other was the Company B, the 11th Kansas Cavalry. Those were the 2. And the 11th Kansas Cavalry, their job was to go west. And they went, in 1865, they spent time going up west, and they went up to, through Marshall County, out to Kearney, and then out to Platte Bridge, Wyoming. And as they went through, their families oftentimes went with them for a while, and a lot of them came to Marshall County. Now, others had also explored what it's like to go further north, because you have the Independence Trail and the California Trail. They all come through Marshall County, going up to the Platte River. And so these people traveled along that way, and they came to Marshall County, and there's land available, and people sold their land to other people and made sure that people knew it was available. And so the Waters and the Wassons and the Crafts and several others, and I'm going to name some of them, all came to Marshall County between 1860 and 1865. There's the Baltenbergs and the Bivens and the Yeagers and the McDonalds and the Hollenbecks and the Scholes and the Bakers. Now, they're all related to the Waters and the Wassons, but they're all independent families that came to Marshall County. Some did not stay here very long. A few people said, oh, let's go to Oregon, because we heard out in Oregon they got plenty of stuff. And other people said, hey, did you know there's gold in California? And so off to California they went. But a lot of them did stay, and they intermarried, and they became part of this area of Marshall County. One of the brothers, James Waters, went to Beatty, Kansas, and his family all were in the Beatty's area. And then there, of course, Charles Jewell's family, they related to Waterville for a long time. And the Crafts came to Blue Rapids. Well, it wasn't a city yet, but by 1870, the Crafts were here, both Samuel and Rufus. And Samuel Craft, he married the Waters. So you see the connections? All of us have these type of connections which take us back a long ways into our ancestry. Thomas Garvin Waters, who was the man who had the first hotel in Holton, his middle name was Garvin. If you're related to the Waters, or the Jewells, or the Wassons, and you go back 3 more generations, you'll find, and you might see it on your paper, that they were related to the Garvin family. Garvins and Waters married each other in South Carolina before they went to Indiana. Okay, I'm going to stop for a minute, see if there's any questions yet about what I've said, because we're going to go on and talk more specifically about individuals in a minute. Any comments, questions?
I grew up in Holton,
You did?
and that's where I graduated, and I had, one of my schoolmates lived in the house that had the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, the Barclays, I think, were part of that house. The
I think
Barclays.
The Starretts had it when I was in school.
Mhm.
Oh, I was just waving.
Oh, you were waving. Okay, well, anyway, yeah, there's a Barclay house there at the time, and they also are now known as part of the Underground Railroad. I don't know, is the house still in existence today?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
You know, when you come through town, you kind of go through the little circle,
Mhm.
and it's kind of on a little rise right there.
On that curve when you go
Mhm.
downtown? Okay.
So how far apart were the stops?
The stops were usually about 15 miles apart because you had children. And interesting situation, John Brown came over to Kansas and went into Missouri and stole slaves with their families. And then he came into Kansas and went. I was always amazed. I always thought that when I was a young person that they would have gone this direction. No, they came from Missouri and they went up through Kansas and then up through Iowa because those are free states. Instead of going across Missouri, which was a slave state. And so anyway, they would take these families and they would deposit them at a safe house, and then hopefully there's a storm at night. And in the night, then during the storm, they would take off and they'd go to the next safe house. And they'd stay there for a couple days. And the trek sometimes took as much as 2 or 3 months to get from Missouri all the way to Canada. But you can understand they're not riding, they're walking all this way.
There's a little town over there by Sabetha that had a cabin and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
We went over there one time, there was some stuff.
You go from Holton straight north, to Nebraska City, and you come to Sabetha and other towns along the way, and they all had, every 15, 20 miles, they had these places, they called them stations, and they had these places all the way along. Interesting one in Nebraska City, the cabin exists today. It's downtown, well, not quite downtown, but almost downtown, not too far from the tree, Arbor Museum, that type of thing. It's downtown, but it used to be further out, and a road came through, and they made them move it. So the cabin is the present cabin exists and is the original cabin. But some people, after they moved the cabin, they dug a tunnel and a cave to represent what it looked like before. So the only thing real about it is the cabin, and I was looking up about the cabin, and I guess there was some major problems with the cabin because of water and things like that, and so it's closed today. You can't go, but for a while they would let people go through and see it. It's a historical site, Federal Historical Society. So, yeah.
We went recently to Sycamore Springs, and they were talking about stuff too. Was that part of your research?
You know, there are so many of these stations, and it was so quiet about, people were not allowed to say who was part of their group. I mean, nobody was supposed to ever write down. In Watsonville, the family said that they were never to write down anybody's name of any of the people that stayed there or anybody that was involved. Everything was done verbally to someone else, and the Watsons were never to talk to anybody about the slaves coming through or anything. And so you go and read in the history books, and you will not find very many names. What you will find is a list of people who were abolitionists in the community, people who were really strongly in favor of free states and doing away with slavery. You'll find lists of those people, but you will not find lists of the people who were running these different stations along the track. Yeah.
Was it the Underground Railroad because it was on the down low, or did they always store them underground for a while?
No, the idea underground meaning, we aren't going to talk about it.
Okay.
It's just a term
Right.
for meaning that we're not going to talk
I
about
didn't
it.
know because you said something about caves and stuff.
Oh,
and
well,
you know, underground they stored
yeah,
them for a
well,
while. Some places did, but some places
That's right. But
Okay.
but they had to, you know,
keep them outside.
yeah, even in 1845, when Iowa became a free state, the governor was against abolitionists. Even the governor was favor of slavery. And so you had a conflict within these areas, so you didn't dare tell people what you were doing about slave trade and that type of thing. So, but I don't think, in Watsonville there wasn't an underground, but they had there wasn't like a tunnel or anything, but there was a basement type area in that area.
It would be fun to see the quilts or a picture of the pattern at each one of the places.
Oh,
and told them
yeah.
which way to go. 'Cause
Well, there are people doing lots of research, and you can read about these things. For instance, I read all the letters of John Brown, and he was told when he left New York, a lot of people who had money said, when you get out there, we'll send you money. Well, he wrote back to his wife in, I think it was early July of 1857, he wrote back to his wife and said, we've been eating, his son and he, Orrin, his son, and he traveled across the state, and he said, we only had 3 different things to eat. No, actually, some type of sourdough and things like that. But he wasn't getting any money from the East, and he was pretty upset about that. And he wanted money to set up an army. They were organizing an army out in western Iowa. And the idea was that this army would eventually do away with all the people who believed in slavery. I mean, he had great ideas. He also had some illness problems as well. And of course, he died because he was captured at Fort Sumter and tried, and he was hung. And so he died in 1859. An interesting character.
Believed in.
He had 2 other sons who came to Kansas with the idea that they were going to help him. And the bushwhackers from Missouri burned their houses. And so they said, we're not gonna be a part of this anymore. So they went back to Ohio, and they lived in Ohio. He had 4 daughters and 3 sons, and 7 kids. And